Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever time it is, wherever you are in the world. I'm Malcolm Hawker. I'm the host of the CDO Matters Podcast, and I am glad that you are taking time out of your day or your evening to join us today and have a conversation about all things cloud. Is it feeling cloudy where you are? Maybe it should be, because that's what we're going to be talking about today on the podcast. I know that's a very general, broad discussion. Of course, we're going to focus on data. We're going to focus on data infrastructure, data ecosystems. What do CDOs and other data leaders need to be thinking about from the perspective of the cloud? Since we're talking about the cloud, I am glad to be joined by an expert in the cloud, Ayman Husain. Thanks for joining us today.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Ayman, why don't you share a little bit of insight on your background, or is particularly the last couple of positions you've had, but I know you've got a long consulting background as well, but just share a little bit of your background and your expertise so people know where you're coming from, the perspective of your cloud expertise.
Absolutely. I'll start with a little bit of storytelling here. I had a mentor who said, hey, if you want to figure out how the sauce is made, you should find out all the moving pieces of the puzzle and start working upstream. So with my journey to where I am today, I'm with Google today. And prior to Google, I was with Microsoft. And prior to Microsoft, I was at a strategy consulting company called Slalom. And if you think of why I've chosen these careers in this journey effectively, is to figure out where decisions are made for corporations and enterprises that influence technology adoption and what directionally they're going to do. So my career is essentially a stepping stone of roles and jobs where I wanted to figure out who's making those decisions, where are they coming from, and working upstream to that space, what gives me the ability to see where these decisions are made. And along the way, you have to pause for a little bit, understand what these roles and responsibilities are. For example, you're a CDO, interfacing with other CDOs and other organizations, understanding what their initiatives are. And so the journey paths required me to be a strategy consultant, where I actually understood how strategy, implementation solutions, and consulting influences this decision making. And then I picked a couple of brands. In this case, I picked Microsoft for a while, and now I'm at Google, to understand how technology, software companies, and telecom companies are creating solutions and capabilities to address those strategies that are being in place to ultimately serve a customer's outcome and need for whatever the business and industry vertical they're in. So that's where I am coming from. So today at Google, I'm a customer engineering leader. My role and responsibility is to help customers do more with the technology, but for the right purpose. So my experts and I get engaged to understand what the business solution outcome you're looking for and see if we have the right Lego blocks and pieces to make it happen.
Well, so that's an interesting kind of lens from a career progression, understanding decision makers and understanding what makes them tick. I think if you were to ask me to tell a similar story, I would have gone from the view of more of problem solving, right? I'm a natural problem solver. And it's not like I don't care who the decision maker is. I certainly do. Of course, I work for a software company. We need to care about these things, but it's an interesting perspective. So then who is the decision maker in the cloud? Or is this mostly a CIO decision where the CDO is being seen more as a beneficiary or a user? Or are you seeing CDOs influence or even own decisions about cloud migrations?
It's a great way to segue, right? It's an evolutionary, non-linear way to think of it. There was a time when CIOs, CTOs would make decisions in spaces like this. The role of a CDO, as you know, is relatively new in the context of leaderships and in these organizations or in solution-providing organizations. And what I've observed is the supporting roles, CDO, CTI, CIO, CMO, you name it, CRO, all of these are there to achieve a broad functional differentiator for the enterprise. If you are in business of profiting, you want to have low cost, high revenue. And if you think of that mindset, you want to build solutions using technology to have the right approach to solve that problem. Now, the decision makers are really more decision order givers. They want something to happen, a board level conversation, a very high level investor conversation. And then the roles and responsibilities of the C-suite will now step in and take care of it. For a CDO, it's all about data. For a CTO, it might be all about the hardware and the technology. CIO would be about the information that data has and how to manage that. And so the decision-making, depending on the solution space, really now has segregation, not because of a need to have it. It's getting complex, it's getting big, and therefore these roles are separating from the original C-suite role of a CTO or CIO that just did everything. Now we're kind of segregating it based on the fact that these swim lanes are getting very complex. Some companies even have a cloud officer, a chief cloud officer, to understand how optimized cloud rollouts are going to take place and achieve success in that space. So it is clearing the role differentiator, but it's helping vendors and providers like yourself and myself to be very niche and focus on those capabilities that will help enhance that outcome ultimately.
So to paraphrase, CIO is driving from the perspective of infrastructure and scalability. CDO is driving from the perspective of data, insights, analytics, data science, AI. Those things need to come together and be kind of lockstep in order to make sure that whatever you're doing from a technology perspective aligns from a strategy perspective. Okay, makes total sense. So this may sound like maybe a bit of a dumb question, but I ask a lot of dumb questions. There's still a lot of companies that are still just now, working on cloud migrations, correct? I mean, this is not a done deal.
It is. Okay. It hasn't aged out yet. It's still relevant for many organizations.
What a ballpark on percentage? Like, what do you think? Where do you think? Or maybe you have stats on this.
So really, it's on the segment. So you will be surprised. Large enterprise and corporations that are dynastically large have a very low cloud adoption percentage because of the fact that, first of all, the entry cost is so high that they cannot accommodate the entire organization moving to cloud. And the other part of it is they have a lot of capitalized costs. The way they did accounting was different. Yeah. What we see is greater success in medium, small, and even startups that are cloud first, mobile first mindset. And they are winning that conversation because they already have baked into their strategies. For example, if you're a startup and you're going to go raise funds through investors, you better tell them where your money is going to go. So you have an idea. This is where it's going to in product development, software development, cloud costs. You break it out right away. So there's no surprises. But if you're a large company, you're not talking with a revenue officer, a marketing officer, CFO kind of gets involved in a lot of the capitalized costs. And there's a ping pong effect. A lot of people have pivoted hard into the cloud. And then now they're coming back because some of those cost optimizations requires that you understand it in a way that makes sense. I use the car analogy. A lot of people buy cars every 3-4 years. Some people will keep it for 10, 20 years. It's all about what you're doing and what purpose it is. If you're a fleet manager and your job is delivering products using cars, you probably change over your vehicles faster and quicker because that's your moneymaker. You can't afford to have challenges with maintenance and costs otherwise. But if you're just using it for transport or even using it not even in the core business of your revenue generation, you may have a capitalized cost saying we're going to keep these for 10, 12 years. So a lot of the IT expense is kind of wrapped up around that. And therefore, the adoption in the higher enterprises is a lot less than you think it is.
Well, that's interesting. It doesn't surprise me at all that companies are kind of addicted to CapEx and being able to depreciate infrastructure spends, because I've certainly been in that boat and been the beneficiary of kind of use or lose from an OpEx perspective. So that's interesting. Now, is there particularly, I know you are very close to the oil and gas, but where from like a segment perspective do people kind of line up? Is it, you had mentioned mid-size tends to be the ones that are moving a little bit more. Are there any industries that are maybe even lagging a little bit behind others?
Absolutely. Yeah. So industries that tend to have a focus on regulation, both from compliance perspective or safety perspective. You mentioned oil and gas. Yes, I do live in Houston, Texas. A lot of the oil and gas companies are concerned of the impact for safety, both environmental and people, right? So they want to make sure that they're not compromising something that may have a reputation harm or have challenges in the future from a litigation perspective. And so they are a little bit apprehensive to decide. So some of the dynastic industries that have compliance and regulation heavy, healthcare being one of them as well, tend not to do aggressive cloud movement. But then there are industries, for example, retail, has pivoted hard into cloud capability because their business model requires them to be available all the time, ready, available in the context of servicing. And then their cost of infrastructure is so marginally slim that they have to not be able to have cost that is sunk in a CapEx. Like open a store, set up cloud, the store doesn't perform well, shut down the store, that cost goes with it. From a cloud perspective. So retail tends to be very aggressively cloud oriented and so doing very well in that space.
So I'm a CDO and I'm at one of these companies that has not yet kind of made the jump. What are the business pains that I would be experiencing that would make me want to start seriously investigating a cloud migration? Is it a lack of scalability, a lack of flexibility? If I'm a CDO, I may not necessarily have a lot of accountability from just a pure operations perspective. Like I don't own the data center. So as a CDO, what are the things that I should be looking at from a cloud perspective to like, what are the problems that I'm going to be solving with a move to the cloud?
Absolutely. So I'm going to use a story that's happened for real. I'm not going to use the names of the companies. And this is about 15 years ago, 20 years almost, depending on how you look at it. There was a chief executive of this very large dynastic company. He kind of had a spidey sense that something was not looking right in the world. And he called his CFO and said, close the books. I said, go ahead, close the books. I want to see where we stand. They were publicly traded. At that time, in that juncture, depending on the technology, because they were aged a few years ago, it took him 18 days to close the books end to end. And on day 12, a part of the world in the way of financial markets had a challenge and hiccuped, which cost this company a lot of money. And this C-level officer was significantly peeved because now you have a challenge of analysts and stock market and shareholders said, we need to close the books faster. At that time, and I'm talking almost 10, 15 years ago, when they pivoted and adopted solutions that were both cloud and more modern, they were able to close the books in 8 hours. And now I think they do it even faster. So think of it that way. Why would a CDO be engaged? If you have something that requires you to have the data to make an analytical decision, insights, and you're not able to provide that, you may lose out in context of today's world. For example, the pandemic. No company ever had a disaster and business continuity plan for a pandemic. They had versions of it in smaller pockets. They did not have it in that context. So imagine the CDO officer now has to step up and do something that gives you the ability to pivot around it. A ship goes sideways in the Suez Canal and supply chain logistics take a hiccup. You have to plan for these contingencies. And all of that comes down to, do I know what I have? Can I run analytics against it? Now, that may be a scale conversation. So you can say, hey, I need to scale, so I'm going to use cloud for storing the data as well as use the analytics. Or it could be an internal on-prem conversation for you saying, hey, you know what, I already have the scale. I just need to invest in the right solutions and capability. In oil and gas, one of the things that is very data intensive is seismic processing. And you'll be surprised at how many of these companies still do seismic processing in-house for a couple of reasons. The scale, but also the cost of these high-performance compute clusters and GPU clusters is so cost prohibitive in the cloud in the context of what they need agility for. Sometimes they still maintain their own Cray clusters and these high HPC clusters because they say, look, we're going to run a simulation that will take 28 days to run. That cost in the cloud may bankrupt me, but I already have the sunk cost. I can do this efficiently and build these models and algorithms. Think of like weather forecasters or climate forecasters, whatever it is. Air pattern, sea patterns, whatever they want to do, they will use a traditional method to do that, but the role still applies. You need to know what the data is doing, how it's doing it. So you as a CDO, also coming from the employer that you are with, does that products make sense? Because just knowing what the data is not good enough. You need to classify and to understand and make sure that the data is appropriate for the decision making you're going to make.
So when looking more at a migration from just a pure kind of roadmap and execution perspective, when I'm looking at putting together some sort of a plan, right? I'm a CDO and I need to understand kind of the before and after. What do those plans typically look like? I mean, if I'm building software, I've got a plan to build the software, right? I've got requirements to build the software. But if I'm making one of these large scale migrations and I'm thinking really about that scalable data infrastructure that you were just talking about, is there such a thing as like a cloud migration plan? What do I need to be thinking about?
Absolutely. There absolutely is a cloud migration plan. I'll use another analogy and example. Let's say you're a home builder and you have a lot of property that's vacant and you're going to build homes on it. Unless you're, uber rich, you're probably taking a loan from a bank and the bank loan is going to have an interest payment that's due every month. So your job is to build that property fast and quick. Now, you can't build a house and a property just because you want to. You have to get contractors, the lumber, all the supplies that needs to go. So you have to sequence it in a way that when you start engaging building, you're ready to go, because you cannot have a couple of months of gaps where you're paying the bank, but you don't have a reward because you can't sell the house. Same thing applies to cloud and cloud foundations for the journey to the cloud. If you're not ready and you fire up the cloud and you move 1 petabyte of data and then you sit around for 3 months because you're not using that data, that petabyte of data is going to cost you money in the cloud. So you have to have a framework. So almost all hyperscalers have a framework of the journey into the cloud And what the providers like yourself and us are focusing on is like, you don't have to do all of it in day one. Let's figure out how to decouple the things that make sense. Marketing data, maybe that goes to the cloud. Maybe payroll data doesn't go yet. Maybe ERP and some of the complexity of those stay for a while. But you don't want to say, I'm going to need 20 petabytes of storage in the cloud. Let's go buy it right now, but not use it. Your cost to those hyperscalers is still going to stay. You're going to have to pay them. So you want to have that journey map, foundational map understood. And one of the catalysts of this foundational journey is security and governance. So if you haven't done that bit of homework, then you know what? Pause, don't go to the cloud, do your governance and security, because guess what? It applies to your internal data center as well. We just call it cloud, which means somebody else is taking care of a lot of the management and operational part of it. But if you run your own data center, you should treat it like your own internal private cloud. And it should have the same level of security, governance, and capability. You can't just take shortcuts anymore.
So that it seems like there's a bit of a tension there. I don't know. I'd love to pick your brain on this. In that it seems like you could make a reasonable argument for a big bang, but we all know that big bangs are high risk, right? It seems like you could make a reasonable argument for a big bang. But what you're saying is do incremental, take it bit by bit. Where's the balance there? I mean, is there anybody trying to do a big bang? I assume.
There are mitigating circumstances that will make you. For example, let's say you use a colo and your lease is due, and it's going to be done in 12 months. You have an option to release and renew the lease, but these people are not going to renew it by the month. They're going to say sign up for another 5-10 year contract, right? And you may look at it and say, you know what? This is not the right way to spend my money. So you may have a mitigating circumstance that says, I need to exit the colo or get rid of my building data center because I'm moving buildings and I'm not going to renew the list. Whatever it is, you may have to do that. And so it's not an overnight change. You might have like 6 to 12 months to do this. So you have to exit by a certain amount of time, or you have penalty at that point where you're actually paying some kind of a lease problem, or you haven't gotten all systems out. So yes, there are people that will do the big bang approach, but the big bang approach is still over a duration of time. But it is in the context of linearity, very fast and quick. The people that do small approaches to the cloud are the ones that are actually coming from the perspective of, we need to do things differently. Let's try it out in a way of acquisitions, mergers. Let's look at new product development. So a lot of the software-based organizations that are really releasing new products, scalability, trying to have a cloud SaaS mindset, will probably do it as a net new capability and not immediately divest. And then you can start building on top of that mindset and see how they look like. A great example of this is banking and finance, right? They have legacy systems that are very efficient. They're not just going to pivot out of it overnight, but they'll start adding features and functionality that will scale to the cloud for the fact that as those things age out, they will not have the same problems. Where the focus becomes, it's not the cloud. The focus becomes on your operations and management and sustainability of those things. For example, if you're a dev shop, if you're a software developer, if you don't have good mindset of developing in the agile framework, then you need to spend a lot of time on that, because you may not now need to have multiple code sources that need to be published and launched and released. And if you don't have the ability to pivot fast, you're going to be in a challenge. Think of, not too long ago in the news, a major cybersecurity company had a hiccup and it put a lot of people out of work for a while in the context of the systems operating systems. Well, you could have had cloud, you could have scale for the cloud, but you would have been impacted the same way, regardless if it was on-prem or in the cloud. But if you had agility and you had a framework that had decoupled a lot of these moving pieces, yes, you may have still had impact, but you wouldn't have been disastrously as bad in that context. But that framework is not cloud. It's not a cloud provider and a hyperscaler that's going to walk in the door and say, we solved it for you. You actually have to invest in solution provider, partners, strategists, and build that culture, which changes that way of approaching cloud adoption.
So putting on your consultant hat and looking back at some of the larger projects you've been involved in that maybe had a couple hiccups. I'm sure everything wasn't always perfect and not everything was 100% executed. What are like 2 or 3 of the biggest kind of lessons learned, gotchas that you would say to your clients, right? All else being equal, avoid these 2 or 3 big bear traps. What would they be?
Well, there's a contextual bear trap that I always ask my customers not to get accustomed to. Cloud is not necessarily cheap. So don't assume just because you went to the cloud, it's going to be cheaper. With the ramp, with the hockey stick, still not cheap. What the cloud gives you are the things that you probably cannot do today. So fixate on that. Agility, fast, speed, internet, access anywhere, redundancy, reliability, resilience, all of those things are things that you don't want to get tripped up on. So when you think of technology itself, there are certain type of apps that are not very good candidates for the cloud, so they get tripped up on it. For example, if it's a very data-intensive chatty app, you probably don't want to go to the cloud just yet if your user base cannot do the same level of conversation and capability for access. That's why a lot of ERP systems tend not to go to the cloud, because they have not really engineered the product to take out the chattiness of it. Right now, we live in a mobile-first world. A smartphone capability is a big deal. If you're writing apps, even for the cloud, that are not mobile-friendly, adoption probably doesn't happen, and then you still have challenges. So that cost mindset becomes a challenge. So when you think of the biggest hiccups we've had, is understanding the cost footprint of going to the cloud. It's not apples to apples. So you have 10 servers on-prem, 10 servers in the cloud. Great, here's your cost saving, not so. And there are a lot of things that you need to understand. What if out of those 10 servers on-prem, only 2 are production and 8 of them are development boxes? Guess what? The cloud is production 100%. We provide the service so that it's always available to you. If you do not classify that workload properly, now you're spending money for things that you don't use. And so we have to optimize that. So those are the biggest roadblocks and hiccups we've run into, especially on large projects where you take years to get there. And like year 1 looks great, year 2 looks bad, and now the C-suite wants to kill the project and kibosh it entirely because they're not happy with the cost savings or the lack of it. And so you are now in a very precarious problem. You have half in the cloud, half not, and board we decided to not fund it anymore or decided you to do differently. It is a challenge. So those are the hiccups we look out for. What is the outcome you want, and what is the purpose you want? I had a real example of this when I was in consulting. We had a customer that says, hey, I want to go to the cloud. And being the technologist, I was all about it. I provided the best example of how to get to the cloud. We implemented it. And then a few months later, when we were trying to follow up to figure out if they were satisfied, the person was extremely dissatisfied because their cost per portfolio went up by 20%. And they're like, hey, you know what? It cost me more to run in the cloud. And one of the things that we failed to ask is, why did you want to go to the cloud? It turned out this organization, as a small organization, had an exit strategy. They were looking to be bought. And they were trying to show them that they had good cloud mindset and capability because they wanted to put a footprint that looked better than usual. Had I understood the outcome, if that's what they wanted to do, we would have pivoted in a different way for the cloud journey. You know, if the cost savings, reducing the EBITDA, for example, was the way they wanted to shop around for a buyer, you should have told us that, because technology is not cheap always. So understanding the outcome is paramount to success for cloud journeys.
So a lot of what you just said suggests that maybe you don't understand your internal cost drivers, right? There could be some technical debt, systems debt, who knows? You've got processes running, consuming compute resource that you didn't even know necessarily. Is that something that you see?
Absolutely correct. We see that all the time. And we even see it at the granular level where you, on your day job, are very involved in data. Just because you have data and you don't know what it is, it doesn't mean it goes to the cloud. Now, you can go 100% in the cloud, but you're wasting space in the cloud. So you know what your data does, know what it is, know what its classifications are, use purposes it. And then use the appropriate cloud service. And every hyperscaler has a tiered capability in this data space to give you the best bang for your buck. So if you don't know what's going on on-prem, and it's not going to help you in the cloud. So yes, not knowing the data state itself, forget the asset, forget the inventory of actual physical, servers and whatnot. You have to have your asset knowledge of what the data footprint looks like. You have to have the asset knowledge of what the apps look like. Just fails. We have horror stories of customers that says our entire XYZ to the cloud, only to forget that there was a major component that was integrated on-prem with a provider that we no one knew about because it was an API or a connector, and now everything's broken and likely a most business critical function. This actually happened a few years ago where the payroll system was migrated to equivalent cloud system, but they forgot that their integration to the bank to cut the checks for the employees' paycheck delivery was old school dial-up that still was there, and no one realized because that bank was archaic technology, and they were using a modem to dial and send the zeros and ones over a regular telephone line so that payroll file was uploaded and the transactions happened. So things like that, you forget that there might be pieces that you didn't evaluate. Now, there's a lot of vendors that will do kind of a automated way to figure out your dependency of architecture, dependency of data, dependency of solutions and whatnot, but it still requires a human element to go in there and do it. So if you were starting from day zero, document everything, create flowcharts, architecture diagrams, have comments in your code. Otherwise, you will always suffer from that. And these are just evolutionary technology challenges we've had for decades. I mean, like commenting code in app, making sure you have a good inventory system for your software. There'd be GitHub type solutions, or knowing what your data state looks like, security and governance around that. There's so many things that we don't do. I mean, ITIL lives for a reason. They have all these, configuration database mindsets for just that purpose.
Yeah. Well, so do you find any of your clients doing a post migration cleanup, right? Where they migrate and then they find all of this stuff is like, oh my God, we had no idea that there was 200 terabytes of whatever data that was connected to an application that is no longer in production. Who knows, right? This could be 1,000 examples of this, but do you find people all of a sudden going, okay, all right.
Yeah. So one of the things we notice is they do it as it's happening. It's not after the fact. Somebody will be like, hey, we got to move a petabyte of data, and somebody in the decision-making authority will be like, petabyte. I'm like, I thought this app only required 500 gigs. I'm like, where's the petabyte coming from? And then you realize that there's data that was there that you just assumed it was part of the database. Oh yes, storage, backup, multiple iterations of copies of this data environment that you did for whatever purpose. Well, don't move that. So yes, sometimes they will say, okay, we have a petabyte for associate this app, but as the app goes to the cloud, we'll just go get it with the 500 gigs and the rest will be on-prem, and we'll have some kind of archiving solution that will now pivot back. So they're almost like the saying goes, building the plane as they're flying. So a lot of the migrations will actually change as they're happening. And if a good consulting organization, a good integrator gets in there, they should capture that capability ahead of time for you to realize. We also have on-the-fly code changes. For example, you may have a version of a software that already should have been updated, but you didn't. So minor change, update it as you go on the fly, do some UAT, and then you're ready to go. That is also a very uncommon way of doing it, but there's inherent risk on it, and some of this risk can be challenging. That requires a little bit of foresight and planning. That's why consulting organization integrators are sufficiently busy, because a lot of these good decision makers will say, we're not going to go to the cloud just by the pulse check. We need to figure out what that looks like by knowing what we have, and you spend time and money there, then you have a good footprint of how you journey to the cloud.
Awesome. So I assume that there will often be some motivators for people to, okay, well, wait a minute, we got to take stock before we do this migration. Sounds like, again, it's a bit of a balancing act between how much the cleaning up do you do in advance and how much do you do it after the fact. Sounds like a decent amount of the after the fact stuff just happens because you find things you didn't know about. But it sounds to me like as a CDO, you need to be prepared for post-migration to be doing at least some sort of house cleaning. It's probably a natural thing.
Absolutely. And one of the things you got to understand is, look, if a hyperscaler or any organization that's in the business does it right, they should have almost monthly reviews or quarterly reviews to say, hey, this month you spent X thousands of dollars. Nothing has changed, but we've seen an uptick. Therefore, you're adding data or you're taking data out or whatever the conversation is. We should always be striving for optimization. And that's a value add a CDO, CIO, CTO always wants. Like, hey, let's talk about hypervisors or VMware type products. Just because you had 100 servers on-prem, you may not need 100 servers in the cloud. So yes, let's move 100, but immediately let's start optimizing and figuring out maybe we can bundle all these into one massive machine. Therefore, your lesser footprint, I guess what it saves money, cost, licensing, everything, right? So we definitely work in this mindset of optimizing as we go, either in a frequency or annually, depending on where you are. And there's products already out there that will take a look at it for you and tell you this is where you're spending your money and do you need to. Yeah.
So let's talk specifically data and AI. What are some of the top trends that you're seeing from the perspective of a focus on analytics, a focus on AI? Are a lot of people still excited about using the cloud specifically for AI? I assume the answer is yes. A year ago, Absolutely. It seemed like everybody was getting on the AI bandwagon. Maybe that has cooled a little bit. But what are some of the trends you're seeing more in the data and analytics?
Yes, the trends we're seeing is there was a trend that said we need to do analytics and insights in the cloud or anywhere, and the cloud seems like the place to do it. And so that maturity level has reached a peak where they're like, hey, you know what? We're doing very good with it, but what else can we do? What else should we add? I'm like, I use the pandemic and I use weather as a conversation. What if your business is depending on that? Do you have analytics that is tied into a weather database or data capability that gives you that unstructured data for you to go do those things. So what is happening right now, the trend is like we can do analytics fairly well. We can also visualize it fairly well, but we need to add what if scenarios in this. So what if scenarios is a lot of hypothetical conversations with data scientists or business analysts. And so now what's happening, the trend is saying, hey, we want to use analytics in the cloud with this kind of an AI mindset or a generative AI mindset, but we can't do it unless we have all the data there. So that's the pumping of the brakes is the fact that a lot of the commercial enterprise data is already in the cloud or is fairly well established, but we need to add other components to it. So that's the shift we're seeing. A lot of people saying, hey, AI works, we get it. We're sold in some data platform in the cloud, we love it, but we need to add more context to it. So what we are seeing as a business ecosystem propping up where there's data from different sources that you're connecting to and providing a level of success from that perspective as well. Airlines is a great example. Imagine if you are in travel agency having airline data and traffic pattern data and delays of weather pattern. If you put it all together, you can do better what if scenario planning if you're trying to book reservations. Otherwise, today you can just book a hotel, not realize the hotel is under water because there's a flood. Imagine if you had that information, you'd have better insights, but you would use generative AI or AI to help you guide that. So a lot of the data leaders are asking, hey, we want to do data and AI in the cloud for a couple of reasons, but at the same time, we want to do what if scenarios by adding other pieces that are not really core to our business, but this is the best way to start doing it and start believing in the fact that we can have insights that will be differentiating them in the marketplace.
So I'll make an assertion, and then you can either support or refute it. But I'll tell you something that kind of high level observation that I've seen over the last couple of years. There's always been, at least in my world, there's always been a little bit of a distinction between analytics and data, right? Analytics, lakes, warehouses, BI tools. I would argue to a certain degree that from a cloud perspective, there's many people kind of already get it, right? They get the scalability, they get a lot of the flexibility. On the data side of the house, which leans more towards data management, things like data quality, MDM, data integration, data governance, data cataloging, those types of capabilities, I would argue we're kind of playing catch up. But what I'm seeing is a lot of the hyperscalers moving towards that world of data management. We're certainly seeing it on the Microsoft side. Are you seeing this as well?
Yes, we are. And the reason you see both all the hyperscalers thinking about it is because of the massive gap. So think of the conversations I just referred to. We will take you to the cloud. You'll be happy with it. But then you come back and say, my insights are bogus. So where is the problem? Is it my analytical engine? Is it my superior database engine? No, it is the fact that the data wasn't complete or data did not have what you expected it to be because you thought it did, but it really wasn't. So data governance is a gap in the cloud. People understanding what data they have, classification, catalogs, all these are very relevant. So organizations like yourself, your employer, you're in a good place. But the reason these hyperscalers are stepping in is not because they want to take your lunch money. It's because there's a gap. There's no one's figured it out. They need to solve it. Now, what happens with the hyperscalers that are uniquely brand oriented, they were going to do it only for their little patch of it, right? They're not going to do it for all the data that is out there coming from different sources, different capabilities, especially classified data that requires a classification that is based on a very unique identifier. For example, you and I spend a lot of time here in oil and gas capability. There is a unique identifier for a wellhead that is got to be ubiquitous across all the different platforms in industry, including state government agencies. So if you have classified a classification of data not tied to some kind of index or some key, something that really represents that, you're going to have a challenge identifying the data or may have replicated data that need not be there because you did not do that. So you spend a lot of time in ETL. You're spending a lot of time transforming the data, conforming it in a way that ultimately does not give you the end result that you want. So that governance need is paramount. Somebody that can do it for many clouds or different clouds or diversity of ecosystems is going to win that conversation. And I comfortably can say not all hyperscalers will solve it unless they were in the business of that prior to cloud becoming a thing. Like they had a portfolio of software that does it, therefore they're just going to enhance and make more of it. Most of them are reinventing the wheel from the ground up. Some of them are just trying to figure out for their own purpose. For example, a customer may want to know how they're getting charged for their cloud consumption without the classification of data and the governance and MDM. You may have an invoice that says data. Wouldn't it be nice if we could tell you what the data was and what it is so that in your invoice you could see where it's coming from? That requires a level of classification and management that the hyperscaler might need to have to do just to be relevant to the industry and business.
Yeah, I see. It's going to be an interesting few years to see how things kind of shake out on the data management side and where things are going. Because I certainly see the hyperscalers getting more active in that space. We have partnerships with all of the hyperscalers. But like I said, it'll be interesting to see how much of the market for data management software the hyperscalers themselves tend to subsume. I don't have any magic answers there, but there are I just look at, for example, a Purview by Microsoft. They're investing a lot in Purview as a data catalog, and that makes sense, right? Like to get the full view of everything. It makes sense from a management perspective, but even just from a billing perspective, like you were talking about, like understanding what's out there, right? So yeah. It makes sense. It doesn't mean that there can't be others that are also building best of breed solutions that'll work across all hyperscalers. And I think that there's certainly a value there. Well, so let's talk about all of the hyperscalers and let's talk about kind of multi-cloud, right? How many of your clients are running on multiple clouds and how do they address
almost every one of them?
Right.
Well, let's pivot into the fact that I work for Google right now, right? Yeah. Google is a third entry into the cloud space. AWS at the drop, Azure caught up, Google is a third. All my customers have cloud that is not Google. Either it's AWS, Azure, or both. So all the customers are multi-cloud. And so the multi-cloud strategy is not going away. It's going to stay. There is not a compelling cost differentiator that says I need to have a one cloud solution. And most of it is tied to some level of hyperscaler discount that is so amazing that they'll say, you know what, it makes no sense for us to move over. And kind of pivoting back a little bit to the conversation you had with Microsoft Purview. Think of it this way. Microsoft is charging you for that Purview use.
Of course.
Most of our customers will say, I already have my data in the cloud, give it to me for no cost. No one's going to do that. But if they're going to spend money on it, they might as well get the best of breed, right? They may not just say, I don't need Purview from Azure. I need it that takes care of everything on multiple systems. And then there's another thing that evolutionary-wise in the cloud space is becoming more relevant today in the global footprint. Sovereign clouds. A lot of countries and principalities are coming up with rules that says you have to have data in a certain place or location. Well, not every hyperscaler has a data center in every city for you to go consume their service. Sometimes there's a drop with Microsoft, sometimes there's a drop with AWS, sometimes Google, maybe Oracle, maybe IBM. You have a multi-cloud solution now just to have that sovereignty conversation enabled. And therefore, you need a tool that is going to be able to talk across all these capabilities in a way that achieves the data governance, clarity, visibility that you need, because you are tied to your geography, not because of a cloud provider, because of some rules of sovereignty that dictates that. Furthermore, add sensitive data, healthcare data, social security number, financial data that is very unique. And your CISO might have a position saying that I need this data protected in a way that we don't get caught, unaware if we get hacked or compromised. So they want to know where the data is, what the data was, so that if there's a hack, they know right away what that looks like. And so that's happening as well. Okay.
So it seems like there's an interesting opportunity there for companies like us to be a little more multi-cloud. I mean, we already are, but for things like MDM and data quality or data catalogs, I mean, you have to host your infrastructure somewhere, but at the same time, you could be building connectors that have seamless integrations into anything. I would argue maybe that's kind of what Fabric looks like. Are you familiar with Fabric?
I am familiar with Fabric because I did come over from Microsoft recently. Yeah. It is familiar in the context of what you are trying to do, but think of it from the purpose of the data itself.
Right.
A lot of industry data are getting standardized. They're joining forums or some organization that says, let's standardize this data so it's easy for us to share it and use it. When you get to that point, what you're now talking about is speed of data transfer, use, and analytics against it. You don't have to reside the data in multiple clouds or use it in that context. Fabric is kind of allowing you to do that, where you don't have to have the data in the same place, but now you're compromising speed and agility depending on what you're looking at. So you, as a vendor of a product, should develop it in a SaaS model that works in all clouds. Now have a magic sauce behind the scenes that says you can be in any cloud and I can host it in your cloud or other cloud, and we can work across, obviously, the data governance is uniquely classification that allows you for that transport and capability. Otherwise, you do the transformation. But yes, it is a Fabric from Microsoft is a compelling solution, capable solution, but it does not really cover the entirety of it because you have to step up to it, right? You can't just say, I'm going to have old school SQL on-prem and I still want Fabric. There is a level of challenge and modernization that has to be done. And guess what? Someone like you will be very busy because if you have on-prem data, you still need to know what it is. If you tell them to go to Fabric.
Yeah. So one last question. There seems to me to be opportunities here within each of these hyperscaler clouds to allow for levels of intercompany data sharing that isn't really happening today. Or at least I'm not aware of it. When I was at Gartner, I talked a lot about data sharing and opportunities for data sharing, and even things like shared governance and shared management of data. Because when you look at companies' data, if you're B2B, for example, one company has a record for Verizon, another company has a record for Verizon, another company has a record for Verizon, and you know what? They all look largely the same, and they're all managed the same, they're all stewarded the same. The data quality rules are generally all the same. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on, do you see the use of do you see more adoption of, or at least people talking or asking about data sharing in these infrastructures?
They are, absolutely. There's two reasons for it. I don't want to own data that is going to compromise me in the security footprint. So either you keep your data where it is, and we'll just share a little bit of it as needed. Think of the federated security model, right? Many portals on the web and apps require you to sign in with an identity. A lot of these people don't want to save that identity on their own system. So they'll use federated systems like Microsoft or Google or Facebook as the identity capability, and then use business-to-business connector to make it happen. So you will find vendors that will say, look, I don't need that data because then now I have to own that data from a security perspective. Let's just connect. Let's share the data in a way that's common. Therefore, you invest in those organizational changes that make the data reasonably shareable in the context you want. But there's also an IP story. What I mean by that, there's some data you don't want to share because you want to have a competitive edge. And then sometimes that will just be as it is and never be crossed. And there's also a litigation problem. There's a lot of people who feel that if they share data that they did not comprehend, and now they're litigiously tied because something may have some fine print in some EULA that says you can't do that. So there's always that conversation that has to be resolved, but it is trending in the right direction. For example, with all the Gen AI programming and learning models, a lot of people are complaining, oh, you took my book and wrote it, or you used my YouTube content to create it. You will reach a place where even the sharing of the data needs to be compartmentalized into what it is and what it is not. And therefore, that journey will be a little slower, but it is happening. It's getting rapidly capable in a way that even some data shared between competition is useful. And there are only a half a dozen players in the world that can monitor the world for cyber threats. Guess what? When one organization gets impacted, they actually call their competition and say, hey, did you guys see that same thing happening? To verify that there's an attack footprint happening. And a lot of these denial of service attacks that happens around the world from enemy nations, those security providers that are in competition in the enterprise space will actually talk to each other to figure out if there is a pattern happening. So there's going to be a level of data sharing also in that space that you will do it for the better good.
It's interesting you should mention that, because when you were talking, that's exactly what I was thinking about. When I was at Gartner, I actually used the network intrusion use case, like the DDoS use case, because there is widespread sharing of the footprints of each of these intrusion attempts across major providers, because there's benefits to all from that. But I still think that's we're going to see more and more of that, because I think there's a value add there. When it comes to just basic stuff like data stewardship, right? Like updating records, right? Like fairly low value add things that a lot of companies are spending a lot of money on. And if you could put in a mechanism for compensating one company for maybe updating a record where everybody benefits from that, I don't know. I think there could be something there.
There's in my mind, there's a variation of this already happening with the credit rating agencies, right? There's
exactly.
You get a bank loan from one that's got the rating from one, they will share it with all three of them because it's going to be on your shared record. So somebody's updating it collectively. Better governance, better capability will help us do all those things, like your home address, your email address, subscription for mail magazine, whatever it is. Things that you forget that if one person changes, they should share it in a ubiquitous way. I'm like the USPS mail system does that. Like if you forward mail, they'll actually tell the sender, this person has moved, and they have digital ways of sharing that data now, so that the sender now updates their database as well, saying that this person has moved with this new address they reported in.
The credit use case is an extremely valid one. It's a give to get model where a lot of companies are literally sharing their AR. Typically, they're doing it through Dun & Bradstreet, not exclusively, but what they get back are the credit ratings. So another great example. Ayman, thank you so much for the conversation today. This is fascinating. I learned a lot about what to avoid from the perspective of a cloud migration, what to expect from a cloud migration. Where can people get in touch with you, learn more about you?
I am big on LinkedIn. I live on that as well. And so if you are able to share through the content of my LinkedIn address, you can take it, reach out to me. I speak to anybody that has time for me as well as vice versa. I'll make time for you. Get hold of me through that. I fairly live on that in the context of social broadcasts as well. So I do have point of view. Sometimes I will share. So please share that information. I'll be available to anybody that cares to learn more, talk more, and understand how things are happening.
Awesome. I knew you were active on LinkedIn. That's why I mentioned it. So anyway, to our listeners, to our subscribers, to our followers, thank you so much for being a part of this growing community of data practitioners and leaders. I'm Malcolm Hawker. I'm thrilled you were able to join us today. Stay tuned for another episode of the CDO Matters podcast sometime very soon. Ayman, thanks again. Thanks, everybody.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you.